Deep within the marble corridors of the Vatican, something extraordinary happened that would send shockwaves through the entire Christian world. Picture this: the most powerful religious leader on earth, holding a document that had been hidden for over 8 decades, suddenly freezing mid-sentence as his eyes processed words that seemed to predict his very existence. For 6 full seconds, Pope Leo XIV said absolutely nothing. No movement, no breathing, just pure stunned silence as the weight of prophecy crashed down upon him. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about modern Christianity. This isn't just another Vatican story about ancient documents or theological debates. This is about a revelation so powerful that it threatens to either heal the deepest wound in Christian history or tear the Catholic Church apart from within. And it all started with a burst water pipe in a forgotten corner of the Vatican archives. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need to know something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you tuning in from the United States, somewhere in Europe, perhaps from Asia or Africa? Drop a comment below and let me know your location. It fascinates me to see how stories like this reach believers across every continent, connecting us through shared faith and curiosity about the divine mysteries that shape our world. And if this is your first time here, or if you've been watching but haven't subscribed yet, I want to personally invite you to hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the hidden stories, the prophetic moments, and the extraordinary events that most mainstream outlets won't touch. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't satisfied with surface-level reporting about matters of faith. Every subscription helps us reach more people who are hungry for authentic spiritual content in a world full of distractions and deception. Now, let's journey back to that pivotal moment in November 2025. When everything changed. Monsignor Giuseppe Torretti had spent 23 years working in the Vatican's apostolic archives. At 62 years old, he was known for his methodical approach, his careful attention to detail, and his absolute commitment to preserving the Church's most precious historical documents. For more than 2 decades, he had moved through those ancient halls with the reverence of a monk, cataloging manuscripts, maintaining records, and ensuring that centuries of Catholic heritage remained intact for future generations. November 27th started as what seemed like any other routine day. Overnight, a water pipe had burst in the eastern wing of the archives, causing minor flooding that required immediate attention. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would make headlines, just the kind of maintenance issue that occasionally disrupts the quiet work of preserving history. Torretti and his small team were tasked with relocating several crates of documents from the pontificate of Pope Pius XI, materials dating back to the turbulent decades of the 1920s and 30s. As they carefully transported these precious containers to temporary storage, Torretti noticed something peculiar about one particular wooden crate. His trained eye, honed by decades of handling historical artifacts, detected subtle inconsistencies. The proportions seemed wrong. The weight distribution felt unusual. Most telling of all, the bottom didn't sit quite right against the floor. For someone who had examined thousands of similar containers, these small details created an unmistakable sense that something was hidden. Kneeling beside the crate, Torretti ran his experienced fingers along the edges of the base. When he applied gentle pressure to one corner, he heard a soft crack as a false bottom gave way, revealing a concealed compartment that had remained untouched for more than 80 years. Inside lay a single envelope, sealed with red wax bearing the papal seal of 1944. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable to anyone familiar with the history of Fatima. Those delicate flowing letters belonged to Sister Lucia dos Santos, the Portuguese nun who had witnessed the apparitions of the Virgin Mary in 1917. But what made Torretti's hands begin to tremble was the small note attached to the envelope, written in Portuguese. The words I could not write in the first letter about the third secret. This discovery represented potentially one of the most significant finds in modern Catholic history. The Third Secret of Fatima had been officially revealed by the Vatican in the year 2000, describing a vision of a bishop dressed in white being attacked and killed. Yet for decades, rumors had persisted that the full truth had never been disclosed. That Sister Lucia had held something back, that there were additional revelations too sensitive or too dangerous to share with the world. Now, in Toretti's trembling hands, was what appeared to be proof that those rumors were true. This wasn't just another historical document. This was potentially the missing piece of one of the Catholic Church's greatest mysteries, a revelation that had been hidden away, waiting for the right moment or the right person to discover it. Understanding the gravity of what he held, Toretti immediately sealed off the area and secured the envelope in a protective case. Only one person in the entire Vatican had the authority to open such a document, and Toretti knew he needed to deliver it personally. His heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, he made his way through the marble corridors toward the Pope's private quarters, carrying what might be the most important letter in modern church history. Pope Leo XIV received Monsignor Toretti in his private study within minutes of the request for an urgent meeting. The room reflected the Pope's humble character. Simple wooden furniture, a modest crucifix on the wall, a small bookshelf filled with theological texts, and an image of Our Lady of Good Counsel. There was no ostentation, no display of wealth or power, just the basic necessities for a man dedicated to prayer and reflection. With trembling hands, Toretti presented the sealed envelope to His Holiness. "Santo Padre," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This was hidden in the archives since 1944. The seal remains intact. The handwriting belongs to Sister Lucia, and the attached note indicates these are words she could not include in her original letter about the Third Secret." The Pope examined the envelope for a long moment, feeling the weight of history in his hands. With careful, deliberate movements, he broke the ancient wax seal that had protected these secrets for more than 8 decades. The parchment inside had yellowed with age, but the ink remained vivid and clear, as if the words themselves possessed an eternal quality that transcended time. At the top of the page was a date, January 3rd, 1944. Below it, words that would change the course of modern Christianity forever. Sister Lucia had written that she was recording these revelations in obedience to Our Lady, who had instructed her to document the words she could not include in her first letter about the Third Secret because the world was not yet prepared to receive them. But then came the line that made both men hold their breath. The letter stated that Our Lady had revealed a time would come when an Augustinian pope from America would be called to reveal the complete truth. Pope Leo XIV felt his blood turn to ice as he read those words. He was indeed Augustinian, a member of that religious order. He was indeed from America, born and raised in Chicago, and he was the first American-born pope in the entire 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. Sister Lucia had written these words in 1944, 31 years before he was even born, yet they described him with impossible precision. This wasn't coincidence or lucky guessing. This was prophecy of the highest order, divine revelation that transcended human understanding and pointed directly to this moment in time. As Pope Leo XIV continued reading, his hands began to shake. The letter described a vision that went far beyond the bishop dressed in white that the world already knew about. Sister Lucia wrote of seeing 2 lungs of the church, one in the west and one in the east, struggling to breathe together. For 1,000 years, she explained, these lungs had been separated, weakened, unable to function as the unified body they were meant to be. The Catholic lung and the Orthodox lung, both essential parts of the same organism, had been divided since the Great Schism of 1054. This ancient wound had never fully healed, leaving Christianity fractured and incomplete. The letter revealed that Our Lady had shown Sister Lucia that unity between these 2 great traditions was possible, but it would come at a terrible cost and would require the revelation of a truth that both sides had long hidden. Most shocking of all was the prophecy about opposition that would arise. The letter warned that a cardinal whose name means fortress would rise to challenge the American Pope who dared to speak this hidden truth. He would believe he was defending the faith, but the path to true healing could only come through what appeared to be breaking. Only through what seemed like wounding could genuine unity be achieved. Pope Leo XIV stopped reading and stared at the parchment for 6 full seconds. His mind raced as he processed the implications. Cardinal Raymond Burke immediately came to mind. In Old English, the name Burke derives from words meaning fortress or stronghold. Cardinal Burke was one of the most influential and outspoken voices in the Catholic Church, known for his unwavering defense of traditional doctrine and his willingness to publicly challenge church leaders when he believed they had strayed from authentic teaching. The prophecy was describing Cardinal Burke with the same impossible precision with which it had described him. An ancient nun, writing decades before either of them was born, had somehow foreseen this exact moment, these exact people, and the conflict that was about to unfold. The weight of destiny pressed down upon Pope Leo XIV as he realized he was holding not just a letter, but a roadmap to the future of Christianity itself. This document revealed that everything that was about to happen had been foreseen, planned, and prepared by divine providence. The question that remained was whether he would have the courage to follow the path it illuminated, even knowing the tremendous cost that lay ahead. Monsignor Toretti watched in stunned silence as his pope processed the magnitude of what lay before them. The elderly archivist had witnessed many extraordinary moments during his decades of service, but nothing had prepared him for this. He could see the transformation happening in real time as Pope Leo XIV grappled with the reality that his entire life, his calling to the priesthood, his unexpected elevation to the papacy, had all been part of a divine plan set in motion nearly a century ago. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of prophecy and possibility. Finally, Pope Leo XIV spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "This changes everything, doesn't it, Giuseppe?" The use of his first name caught Toretti off guard. In 23 years of service, no pope had ever addressed him so personally, so intimately. "Santo Padre," Toretti replied carefully, "I believe we are witnessing something beyond our understanding. But what troubles me is what comes next. If this prophecy is true, if Cardinal Burke is destined to oppose you, then we must prepare for a storm unlike anything the Church has seen in generations." The Pope nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the ancient parchment. The letter continued with details that made his heart race. Sister Lucia had written about specific events that would unfold, signs that would confirm the authenticity of her vision. She described a discovery that would happen in the Vatican archives during a time of water, when hidden things would be revealed to prepare the way. The burst pipe that morning suddenly seemed less like coincidence and more like divine orchestration. But perhaps most disturbing was what the letter revealed about the nature of the opposition that would arise. Sister Lucia had seen that the resistance would not come from enemies of the faith, but from those who loved the Church most deeply. Cardinal Burke and those who would stand with him genuinely believed they were protecting sacred tradition from compromise and corruption. Their opposition would be rooted not in malice, but in sincere conviction that any theological adjustment for the sake of unity represented a betrayal of eternal truth. This made the coming conflict infinitely more painful and complex. Pope Leo XIV wouldn't be facing enemies, but brothers in Christ who saw him as the enemy. These weren't power-hungry politicians or secular critics, but devoted servants of God who would view his actions as the gravest threat the Church had faced in centuries. The letter also contained specific instructions about how the revelation should be shared with the world. Sister Lucia had been told that the truth could not be imposed from above, but must emerge through dialogue and discernment. A special gathering would need to be convened, bringing together representatives from both the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, along with theologians and bishops who could examine the theological implications with wisdom and prayer. Most remarkably, the prophecy indicated that this gathering would not happen in Rome, as tradition would dictate, but in a place that held significance for both churches. Sister Lucia had seen a vision of ancient walls and golden domes, a city where East and West had once been united before the Great Division. Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, emerged as the only location that fit this description perfectly. As Pope Leo XIV absorbed these details, he began to understand the full scope of what was being asked of him. This wasn't simply about making a theological statement or issuing a papal decree. This was about orchestrating the most complex and sensitive religious dialogue in a millennium, bringing together communities that had been separated by centuries of mistrust, misunderstanding, and wounded pride. The practical challenges seemed almost insurmountable. How could he convince the Orthodox patriarchs to participate in such a gathering when they had rejected similar overtures for decades? How could he maintain the support of his own bishops when traditionalist cardinals like Burke would see any compromise as apostasy? How could he navigate the complex theological questions about Mary's role in salvation without either diluting Catholic teaching or alienating Orthodox sensibilities? Yet the letter seemed to anticipate these concerns. Sister Lucia had written that the way forward would not require either side to abandon their core beliefs, but rather to understand those beliefs more deeply and express them in ways that built bridges rather than walls. The issue was not what the Church taught about Mary, but how that teaching was articulated and understood in relation to Christ's unique role as Redeemer. The prophecy suggested that both traditions had developed incomplete understandings of Mary's cooperation in salvation, precisely because they had been separated from each other for so long. The Catholic emphasis on Mary's active participation needed the Orthodox emphasis on Christ's absolute primacy, while the Orthodox reverence for Mary as Theotokos needed the Catholic understanding of her ongoing intercession and care for the Church. Pope Leo XIV found himself thinking about the great theologians and mystics who had written about the Church breathing with two lungs. St. John Paul II had used this image to describe the relationship between East and West, but perhaps he hadn't fully grasped how literal that metaphor truly was. A body with only one functioning lung was not healthy, no matter how strong that lung might be. True vitality required both lungs working in harmony, each contributing its unique capacity to the overall health of the organism. But the letter also contained a sobering warning about the cost of this healing. Sister Lucia had seen that the process would involve genuine suffering for all involved. Traditional Catholics would feel that their most cherished devotions were being questioned or diminished. Orthodox Christians would struggle with the idea that reunion might require accepting some degree of papal authority they had rejected for centuries. And the Pope himself would face the most intense opposition of his pontificate, with some questioning not just his decisions but his very legitimacy. The prophecy painted a picture of a church in crisis, with public disagreements, media scrutiny, and the possibility of actual schism. Some bishops would refuse to accept the theological developments, potentially creating parallel structures that rejected papal authority on this issue. Some Orthodox communities would withdraw from dialogue, preferring the safety of separation to the risk of compromise. And throughout it all, the secular world would watch with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, many assuming that this ancient institution was finally tearing itself apart. Yet Sister Lucia's vision also contained hope. She had seen beyond the immediate crisis to a moment of breakthrough, when the theological impasse would suddenly give way to genuine understanding. The key would come not from compromise or negotiation, but from a deeper penetration into the mystery of Mary's relationship with her Son. Both traditions would discover that their apparent disagreements were actually complementary insights into a reality too vast for either to grasp alone. The letter described this moment of breakthrough in mystical terms that were difficult to interpret fully. Sister Lucia wrote of seeing Mary herself present at the gathering, not visibly but spiritually, guiding the participants toward truth. She had seen tears of recognition as ancient misunderstandings were finally resolved, and joy as communities that had been separated for a millennium rediscovered their fundamental unity in Christ. Pope Leo XIV closed his eyes and tried to imagine such a moment. Could it really be possible? Could the wound that had bled for 1,000 years actually be healed in his lifetime? Could the body of Christ truly breathe with both lungs again? The very idea seemed too wonderful to believe. Yet the precision of the prophecy's other details made it difficult to dismiss. Opening his eyes, he looked at Monsignor Toretti, who had been waiting patiently for guidance about what should happen next. The practical questions were immediate and urgent. Who else should know about this discovery? How should the information be shared? What steps needed to be taken to begin the process Sister Lucia had described? "Giuseppe," the Pope said finally, "I need you to understand that what we have read here today cannot leave this room until I have had time to pray and discern the proper way forward. This is not merely a historical discovery. This is a call to action that could reshape the entire Christian world. But it must be handled with extraordinary wisdom and care." Toretti nodded solemnly. "Of course, Santo Padre. But may I ask, do you believe it is authentic? Do you believe this prophecy is truly from Our Lady of Fatima?" Pope Leo XIV was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Giuseppe, 3 weeks ago, if someone had told me that I would be sitting here reading a prophecy that described my life with impossible accuracy, I would have suggested they seek psychological counseling. But I cannot deny what is before my eyes. The details are too specific, too precise to be coincidence or clever guessing. And more than that, I feel in my heart that this is real. This is why I was chosen for this office, why God permitted an American to become Pope for the first time in history. The weight of divine calling settled upon him like a mantle he had never asked to wear but could no longer refuse. Everything in his life, from his childhood in Chicago to his years serving the poor in Peru, from his unexpected nomination as Cardinal to his even more surprising election as Pope, had been preparation for this moment. Standing up from his chair, Pope Leo XIV walked to the window overlooking St. Peter's Square. Thousands of pilgrims moved through the ancient plaza below, coming from every nation and culture, united in their desire to encounter the sacred. Many of them were Catholics, but he also knew that Orthodox Christians, Protestants, and seekers from many traditions found their way to this place, drawn by something they couldn't always articulate. "Look at them, Giuseppe," he said, gesturing toward the crowds below. "They come here seeking truth, seeking unity with the divine. How can we continue to tell them that the body of Christ is divided, that the church Christ founded has been broken for 1,000 years? If there is even a possibility that this division could be healed, don't we have an obligation to pursue it with everything we have?" Toretti joined him at the window. "Santo Padre, I believe you are right. But I also fear what Cardinal Burke and those who think like him will do when they learn of this. They will not see this as healing. They will see it as betrayal." The Pope nodded grimly. "Yes, and that may be the heaviest cross I will have to bear. To be misunderstood and opposed by people I respect and love, people who serve God with sincere hearts but cannot see what I am beginning to see." He paused, then continued with growing conviction. "But if Sister Lucia is right, if this truly is heaven's plan, then God will provide the grace necessary to see it through. To see it through." The decision weighing on Pope Leo XIV's shoulders wasn't just about theology or church politics. It was about stepping into a role that seemed almost impossible to fulfill. As he stood at that window, watching the faithful gather in St. Peter's Square, he realized that every moment of his life had been leading to this crossroads. But understanding your destiny and having the courage to embrace it are two entirely different things. That evening, as news of the discovery began to whisper through the Vatican's corridors, Cardinal Raymond Burke was preparing for what would become the most consequential confrontation of his career. Burke had spent decades building his reputation as an unwavering defender of Catholic orthodoxy. He had challenged bishops, corrected theologians, and even publicly criticized previous popes when he believed they had strayed from authentic teaching. Now, at 73 years old, he sensed that his greatest test was approaching. The Cardinal had received fragmentary reports about some kind of discovery in the archives, something involving Sister Lucia and previously unknown revelations about Fatima. His sources were limited, but what he heard troubled him deeply. Rumors suggested that Pope Leo XIV was considering some form of theological accommodation with the Orthodox Church, potentially involving a re-examination of Catholic teaching about the Blessed Virgin Mary's role in salvation. For Burke, This represented a line that could never be crossed. The title, Co-Redemptrix for Mary, wasn't merely a devotional preference or theological opinion. In his understanding, it reflected centuries of doctrinal development, rooted in scripture, tradition, and the lived faith of countless saints and martyrs. To even suggest modifying or contextualizing this teaching for the sake of unity with the Orthodox would constitute, in his view, a fundamental betrayal of the deposit of faith. What Burke didn't yet know was that the prophecy had specifically mentioned him. Sister Lucia's letter had warned of a cardinal whose name means fortress, who would rise to oppose the American Pope. The symbolism was almost too perfect to believe. Burke's very name, derived from the Old English word for stronghold or fortification, seemed to have been chosen by Providence itself to fulfill this ancient prediction. As Burke prepared his response to what he perceived as a looming crisis, he began reaching out to his network of traditional bishops and cardinals around the world. His phone calls that evening would set in motion a chain of events that would divide the Catholic Church more dramatically than any controversy since the Second Vatican Council. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, another crucial player in this unfolding drama was receiving his own disturbing intelligence. His All-Holiness Bartholomew I, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, had maintained careful diplomatic relations with Rome for years. As the first among equals in the Orthodox world, he had participated in numerous interfaith dialogues and had even met with recent popes to discuss the possibility of greater cooperation between their churches. But Bartholomew was also acutely aware of how sensitive his fellow Orthodox patriarchs were to any suggestion of theological compromise with Rome. The wounds from the Great Schism of 1054 ran deeper than most Catholics realized. For Orthodox Christians, the issue wasn't simply about papal authority or liturgical differences. It was about fundamental questions of how salvation worked, how the Trinity functioned, and what role human beings played in God's plan of redemption. The Patriarch's sources in Rome had begun reporting unusual activity around discussions of Marian theology. While the reports were vague, they suggested that Pope Leo XIV was contemplating some kind of major initiative involving Orthodox Catholic relations. For Bartholomew, this raised immediate concerns. Previous attempts at reunion had often involved Rome making grand gestures that ultimately required Orthodox Christians to accept Catholic theological positions they had rejected for centuries. What made this situation even more complex was Bartholomew's genuine respect for Pope Leo XIV as a person. Unlike some of his predecessors, the American Pope had demonstrated real humility and authentic concern for Christian unity. He had reached out to Orthodox communities with warmth and sincerity, without the condescension that had characterized some earlier papal initiatives. If anyone could navigate the delicate process of reunion, it might be him. But respect for a person's character and willingness to compromise on fundamental theological principles were entirely different matters. Bartholomew knew that any movement toward reunion would have to be carefully calibrated to avoid triggering the kind of Orthodox backlash that had derailed previous unity efforts. Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV was discovering just how quickly news travels through the Vatican's ancient walls. By the next morning, carefully worded inquiries were arriving from bishops around the world, all asking variations of the same question. Was there truth to the rumors about new Fatima revelations and potential changes in Catholic teaching? The Pope realized he could no longer keep Sister Lucia's letter completely confidential. Too many people had heard fragments of the story, and the speculation was becoming more dangerous than the truth. He needed to get ahead of the narrative before it spiraled out of control. His first decision was to convene a small group of trusted advisors to examine the letter and help him discern the proper way forward. This group would include Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin, Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith Luis Ladaria, and several respected theologians with expertise in both Marian theology and ecumenical relations. But even as he made this decision, Pope Leo XIV knew that Cardinal Burke would inevitably learn about the letter's contents. The question wasn't whether Burke would oppose his plans, but how forcefully and how publicly he would do so. The prophecy had been clear on this point. Opposition would come, and it would come from within the Church itself. What the Pope hadn't anticipated was how quickly that opposition would materialize. Cardinal Burke's network of traditional allies had been activated overnight. Bishops from across the United States, Africa, and Eastern Europe were already beginning to coordinate their response to what they saw as an impending crisis of faith. Archbishop Charles Chaput, retired Archbishop of Philadelphia and a longtime ally of Burke's, was among the first to speak publicly. In a carefully worded statement released through conservative Catholic media, he warned against any attempt to modify the Church's understanding of the Blessed Virgin Mary's unique role in salvation for the sake of false unity with those who reject Catholic teaching. The statement didn't mention Pope Leo XIV directly, but the implication was clear. Traditional Catholics were being prepared for a battle, and their leaders were positioning themselves as the defenders of authentic faith against what they portrayed as dangerous compromise. Similar statements began appearing from bishops in Poland, Nigeria, and the Philippines. Within 48 hours of Sister Lucia's letter being discovered, a global network of resistance was forming, led by Cardinal Burke but extending far beyond his immediate circle of influence. The speed and coordination of this response revealed something important about the current state of the Catholic Church. For years, traditional Catholics had felt increasingly marginalized by what they perceived as the liberal direction of recent pontificates. They had been waiting for a moment to make their stand, and the rumors about potential changes to Marian doctrine provided exactly the rallying point they needed. But the traditional opposition was only one side of the equation. Progressive Catholics and ecumenical activists were equally mobilized, though their response was more cautious and diplomatic. They understood that any movement toward unity with the Orthodox Church would require delicate theological work that could easily be derailed by premature public debate. Cardinal Walter Casper, the former president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, issued his own statement expressing prayerful hope that the Holy Spirit will guide the Church toward the unity Christ desires, while respecting the legitimate concerns of all involved. It was diplomatic language, but the message was clear. Progressives were prepared to support Pope Leo XIV if he moved forward with unity initiatives. The battle lines were being drawn, exactly as Sister Lucia's prophecy had predicted. But what made this conflict different from previous theological controversies was its global scope and the fundamental nature of what was at stake. This wasn't a disagreement about liturgical reforms or administrative changes. This was about the very identity of the Catholic Church and its relationship with the Orthodox world. As Pope Leo XIV prepared for what he knew would be one of the most difficult periods of his pontificate, he found himself returning again and again to the words that had stopped him cold during those 6 seconds of silence. Only through the wound can healing come. Only through the breaking can unity be born. The meaning of those words was becoming clearer with each passing hour. The healing Sister Lucia had foreseen wouldn't come through smooth diplomacy or careful compromise. It would come through a crisis that would test every participant's faith, courage, and commitment to Christ's prayer that they may all be one. The wound was already opening. Cardinal Burke's public opposition was just the beginning. Soon, the entire Catholic world would be forced to choose sides in a conflict that would determine whether Christianity could truly be reunited after 1,000 years of division, or whether the attempt itself would create new fractures that might never heal. Pope Leo XIV understood now that his 6 seconds of silence hadn't been shock or hesitation. They had been preparation. The Holy Spirit had been preparing him for the storm that was about to break, giving him a moment of perfect clarity before stepping into the most challenging period any pope had faced in generations. The prophecy was unfolding exactly as Sister Lucia had foreseen, and there was no turning back. The first crack in Cardinal Burke's fortress of resistance came from an unexpected source. Father Antonio Spadaro, a Jesuit theologian and close advisor to Pope Leo XIV, had been quietly conducting his own research into the theological implications of Sister Lucia's hidden prophecy. What he discovered in the Vatican's theological library would shift the entire debate in ways no one anticipated. Working late into the night, Father Spadaro had been examining centuries-old documents related to Marian theology when he stumbled upon something remarkable. Hidden within the personal papers of St. John XXIII, the Pope who had convened the Second Vatican Council, was a handwritten note dated 1962. The note contained a prayer that John XXIII had apparently composed but never shared publicly, asking the Virgin Mary to guide the Church toward reunion with our separated Orthodox brethren. But what made this discovery explosive was a single line in that prayer. Help us to understand your role in salvation, not as competition with your Son, but as perfect cooperation that reveals His mercy. St. John XXIII had apparently wrestled with the same theological questions that were now dividing the Church, and his private reflections suggested an understanding of Mary's role that was far more nuanced than either traditionalists or Orthodox critics had acknowledged. Father Spadaro immediately brought this discovery to Pope Leo XIV, who recognized its significance instantly. Here was evidence that one of the most beloved popes in modern history had privately questioned whether Catholic expressions of Marian devotion might need refinement for the sake of Christian unity. It wasn't unprecedented theological innovation. It was recovery of wisdom that had been forgotten or suppressed. Armed with this historical precedent, Pope Leo XIV made his next crucial decision. Rather than allowing the controversy to escalate through rumors and speculation, he would address the Church directly. On December 1st, exactly 4 days after the discovery of Sister Lucia's letter, he announced that he would deliver a special address to the College of Cardinals, with the full text to be released simultaneously to the global Catholic community. The announcement sent shockwaves through both traditional and progressive Catholic circles. Cardinal Burke, who had been preparing a more measured response, suddenly found himself forced to accelerate his timeline. He couldn't allow Pope Leo XIV to control the narrative completely, especially if the Pope was planning to invoke papal authority to support his position. That same evening, Burke made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He called an emergency gathering of like-minded cardinals and bishops, scheduling it for the morning before Pope Leo XIV's planned address. The meeting would take place in the ancient Palazzo San Callisto, a Vatican property that had historically been used for sensitive church discussions that required privacy from media attention. The invitation list for Burke's gathering read like a who's who of traditional Catholic leadership. Cardinal Gerhard Müller, the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, confirmed his attendance within hours. Cardinal Robert Serra from Guinea, known for his passionate defense of traditional liturgy and doctrine, sent word that he would fly to Rome immediately. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, whose previous criticisms of papal decisions had made him a hero to traditionalist Catholics worldwide, emerged from his relative seclusion to join what he called the defense of the faith. But Burke's most significant recruitment was Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle from the Philippines. Tagle had generally been considered a moderate voice within the church hierarchy, someone who supported Pope Leo XIV's pastoral approach while maintaining respect for traditional teaching. His willingness to attend Burke's gathering signaled that concerns about the Pope's direction were spreading beyond the traditionalist wing into the mainstream of Catholic leadership. The news of Burke's counter-meeting reached Pope Leo XIV through his Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, who delivered the information with obvious concern. "Santo Padre," Parolin said carefully, "we are facing something unprecedented. Cardinal Burke is not simply expressing disagreement. He is organizing what appears to be formal opposition to papal authority." Pope Leo XIV absorbed this news with the calm that had characterized his response to every aspect of this crisis. "Pietro," he replied, using Cardinal Parolin's first name, "Sister Lucia's prophecy warned us this would happen. Cardinal Burke believes he is defending the faith, and in his heart, I believe his intentions are sincere. But the time has come for the Church to choose between the safety of division and the risk of unity." What Pope Leo XIV didn't yet know was that his upcoming address had attracted attention far beyond Catholic circles. Patriarch Bartholomew had been monitoring developments in Rome with growing interest and concern. The Patriarch's own theological advisors had been analyzing the limited information available about Sister Lucia's letter, and their conclusions were sobering. Dr. John Chrysavgis, the Patriarch's advisor on ecumenical relations, had prepared a confidential briefing that painted a complex picture of opportunities and dangers. "Your All-Holiness," the briefing concluded, "if Pope Leo XIV is genuinely prepared to re-examine Catholic teaching about the Blessed Virgin for the sake of unity, this could represent the most significant opening for reunion since 1054. But we must be extremely careful not to appear to be pressuring Rome toward theological compromise, lest we be accused of manipulating Catholic doctrine for our benefit." The Patriarch's response was characteristically measured. Rather than issuing any public statements, he decided to send a private letter to Pope Leo XIV, expressing his prayers for wisdom and his hope that any theological dialogue would be conducted with the patience and reverence that such sacred matters deserved. But Bartholomew also made a more significant decision. He quietly began reaching out to his fellow Orthodox patriarchs, informing them of the developing situation and seeking their counsel about how the Orthodox Church should respond if Rome indeed proposed new theological discussions. The responses he received revealed the deep complexity of Orthodox attitudes toward reunion. Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, was skeptical. "We have been disappointed too many times by Rome's grand gestures that ultimately require us to accept their theological positions," his response stated. "Until we see concrete evidence of genuine theological flexibility, rather than mere diplomatic overtures, we cannot commit to any formal dialogue." Patriarch John X of Antioch was more optimistic. "If the Patriarch of Rome is truly prepared to examine how both our traditions understand the Theotokos, and if he approaches this examination with genuine openness rather than predetermined conclusions, then we owe it to our Lord's prayer for unity to participate in such discussions." The Patriarch of Jerusalem took a middle position, suggesting that any Orthodox participation should be conditional on clear guarantees that theological discussions would be conducted between equals, without pressure for either side to compromise essential beliefs. As these private consultations continued, Pope Leo XIV was making his final preparations for the address that would either open a path to Christian reunion or trigger the deepest crisis of his pontificate. The text he was preparing would need to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously: explain the discovery of Sister Lucia's letter, address the theological questions it raised, respond to Cardinal Burke's growing opposition, and extend a genuine invitation to the Orthodox Church for renewed dialogue. The theological team Pope Leo XIV had assembled to help prepare his address included some of the Church's most respected scholars. Father Charles Moreyrod, a Swiss Dominican who specialized in ecumenical theology, had been working around the clock to craft language that would be both doctrinally sound and ecumenically sensitive. Sister Sarah Butler, an American theologian with decades of experience in Marian studies, was helping to ensure that any new theological formulations would honor the genuine insights of traditional Catholic devotion while removing barriers to Orthodox acceptance. But perhaps the most crucial member of the team was Cardinal Kurt Koch, president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. Koch had spent years building relationships with Orthodox leaders, and his understanding of Orthodox theological concerns was deeper than almost any other Catholic official. His advice would be essential for crafting an approach that Orthodox patriarchs could seriously consider. As the team worked through multiple drafts of the papal address, they faced a fundamental challenge: how to present theological development as both faithful to tradition and necessary for unity. The solution they developed was both simple and profound. Rather than asking either Catholics or Orthodox to abandon their beliefs, Pope Leo XIV would propose that both traditions had developed incomplete understandings of Mary's role, precisely because they had been separated from each other for so long. The Catholic emphasis on Mary's active cooperation in salvation needed the Orthodox emphasis on Christ's absolute sovereignty. The Orthodox reverence for Mary as Theotokos needed the Catholic understanding of her ongoing maternal care for the Church, Neither tradition was wrong, but both were incomplete without the insights of the other. This theological framework would allow Pope Leo XIV to address Cardinal Burke's concerns while extending a genuine invitation to Orthodox leaders. He wasn't proposing to abandon Catholic teaching, but to deepen it through dialogue with the Orthodox tradition that had preserved complementary insights. The morning of Cardinal Burke's counter-meeting arrived with Rome shrouded in an unusually heavy fog. As traditional Catholic leaders gathered at the Palazzo San Callisto, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation and determination. Burke had prepared remarks that would challenge not just Pope Leo XIV's specific plans, but his authority to make theological changes for diplomatic purposes. Cardinal Muller, serving as Burke's theological advisor for the gathering, had prepared a detailed analysis of why any modification of Catholic Marian doctrine would constitute what he termed apostolic betrayal. His argument was sophisticated and passionate. The Church had no authority to alter teachings that had been revealed through centuries of faithful reflection, regardless of how such alterations might serve ecumenical goals. But as the traditional leaders took their seats in the ornate conference room, an unexpected development was unfolding across Rome. Archbishop Arthur Roche, prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, had made a last-minute decision that would complicate Burke's narrative considerably. Roche had been among the moderate voices within the church hierarchy, generally supportive of Pope Leo XIV, but cautious about rapid changes. However, his own prayer and study of Sister Lucia's letter had led him to a conclusion that surprised even himself. The prophecy contained theological insights that deserved serious consideration, regardless of one's position on ecumenical relations. In a move that caught both traditionalists and progressives off guard, Archbishop Roche released his own statement just hours before Burke's gathering was scheduled to begin. The statement didn't endorse Pope Leo XIV's approach completely, but it called for prayerful discernment rather than predetermined opposition to whatever theological proposals the Pope might offer. More significantly, Roche revealed that he had conducted his own research into the historical development of Catholic Marian theology, and had discovered that several church fathers had expressed views about Mary's role that were more aligned with Orthodox sensibilities than contemporary Catholics generally realized. St. John Chrysostom, one of the most revered theologians in both Catholic and Orthodox traditions, had written about Mary's cooperation with Christ in terms that emphasized her perfect obedience rather than her active participation in redemption. Roche's intervention created exactly the kind of theological complexity that made simple opposition to Pope Leo XIV more difficult to sustain. If respected church fathers had held views that were closer to Orthodox positions than to contemporary Catholic expressions, then theological dialogue wasn't about abandoning tradition but about recovering the full breadth of traditional insights. Cardinal Burke found himself facing a situation he hadn't anticipated. Rather than presenting a united front of traditional opposition to papal innovation, he was now dealing with nuanced positions that acknowledged both the legitimacy of Pope Leo XIV's concerns and the complexity of the theological questions involved. As Burke's gathering convened, the tone was markedly different from what organizers had expected. Instead of passionate speeches about defending the faith against compromise, the discussion became a careful examination of how the Church should respond to genuine theological complexity. Cardinal Tagle, in particular, surprised many attendees by suggesting that opposition to papal authority might be more dangerous than theological dialogue. "My brothers," Tagle said during the morning session, "we must ask ourselves whether we are defending the faith or defending our own understanding of the faith. If the Holy Father has received what appears to be authentic prophetic guidance, do we not owe him at least the courtesy of prayerful consideration before we declare his approach impossible?" The question hung in the air like incense, forcing every participant to examine their motivations more deeply than they had expected. Were they defending eternal truth, or were they protecting familiar formulations that might not be identical to eternal truth? Cardinal Burke realized that his carefully planned resistance was fragmenting before it had even been formally launched. The theological landscape was more complex than simple opposition could address, and some of his most important allies were having second thoughts about the wisdom of public confrontation with papal authority. But Burke was not a man to abandon his convictions easily. If subtle opposition wasn't possible, he would have to consider more dramatic measures. The question was whether he was prepared to risk everything, including his own position within the church hierarchy, for the sake of what he believed to be unchangeable truth. As the morning progressed and Burke's gathering struggled to find consensus, Pope Leo XIV was putting the finishing touches on an address that would change the course of Christian history. In a few hours, he would step before the world and either open the door to unity or trigger the greatest crisis the Catholic Church had faced in generations. The 6 seconds of silence that had begun this extraordinary sequence of events were about to give way to words that would echo through eternity. The atmosphere in the papal apartments that December morning carried a weight that seemed to press against the very walls themselves. Pope Leo XIV stood before his mirror, adjusting the white zucchetto that had become as familiar as his own reflection. Yet today, it felt different, heavier, as if the simple cap now bore the accumulated prayers and expectations of 2 billion Christians scattered across the globe. His private secretary, Monsignor Torretti, knocked softly on the door. "Santo Padre, the cardinals are assembled. Cardinal Burke arrived 15 minutes ago and has taken his customary seat in the front row." The message carried implications that both men understood without discussion. Burke wasn't simply attending as a member of the College of Cardinals. He was positioning himself for maximum visibility during what everyone knew would be a historic confrontation. Walking through the corridors toward the consistory hall, Pope Leo XIV passed beneath centuries-old frescoes depicting moments of triumph and crisis in church history. The painted faces of previous popes seemed to watch him with expressions that ranged from encouragement to warning. Had any of them faced a decision quite like this? Had any of them held in their hands a prophecy that demanded they choose between the safety of tradition and the risk of transformation? The hall fell silent as he entered. 87 cardinals from every continent had gathered, their red vestments creating a sea of scarlet that symbolized their willingness to shed their blood for the faith. But today, that symbolism felt ominous rather than inspiring. Some of these men were prepared to shed blood metaphorically in defense of what they believed to be unchangeable truth. Others were ready to follow their pope into theological territory that previous generations would have considered unthinkable. Cardinal Burke's eyes met those of Pope Leo XIV across the room. In that brief moment of connection, both men seemed to acknowledge what was about to unfold. This wasn't personal animosity or political maneuvering. This was a collision between two sincere interpretations of faithfulness, two different understandings of what it meant to preserve the deposit of faith in a rapidly changing world. Venerable brothers, Pope Leo XIV began, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect space. 4 days ago, divine providence revealed to us a document that challenges everything we thought we knew about our mission in this generation. Today, I share with you not just information, but a calling that extends far beyond any of our individual preferences or theological comfort zones. As those words echoed through the sacred chamber, Pope Leo XIV realized that his 6 seconds of stunned silence had become the fulcrum upon which the future of Christianity would turn. The prophecy written by Sister Lucia 8 decades ago was no longer hidden in dusty archives, but alive in this moment, demanding a response that would either heal wounds that had festered for a millennium or create new divisions that might never mend. The battle between Cardinal Burke's fortress and the Pope's vision for unity was just beginning. But perhaps that's exactly what heaven had ordained all along, that only through the breaking could genuine healing emerge, and only through courage in the face of impossible choices could the Church finally breathe with both lungs again.